The soil test said Elias Reed had finally found the right crop for his worthless Kentucky ridge. By the end of that first summer, nearly 60% of his blueberry plants were dead. The acidity was right. Something else was wrong. To understand what happened, you have to go back to where this started. Kentucky, 1991. Elias Reed was 46 years old, divorced, quiet. A man who had just walked away from more than 20 years on the county road crew. 20 years of watching hillsides, 20 years of noticing things nobody else bothered to look at. Road cuts, drainage lines, frost pockets that formed in the same low spots every winter. He didn't have a diploma that explained any of it. He had a notebook, battered, water-stained, it had ridden in his truck for 2 decades, and an old yellow surveyor's level that still worked, even if the paint had long since given up. 3 farmers had already failed on the same 54 acres Elias eventually bought. The soil was too acidic for corn, too rocky for good pasture, cheap enough that nobody wanted it. Each of those 3 owners had tried the same fix. Lime the soil, fight the acidity, force it into corn, force it into pasture. Every one of them lost that fight, slowly the way land wins when you work against it instead of with it. Elias bought the ridge for $26,000. Not because he thought he could fix the acidity, because after 20 years on that road crew, he'd seen something growing wild in soil just like it. Certain stretches where the county roads cut through acidic, rocky ground, soil nobody would ever call good farmland, and yet along those cuts, berries grew thick every summer, untouched, unplanted, undeniably alive. That memory didn't give Elias an answer, it gave him a question. He didn't know what those wild berries were, or whether they had anything to do with farming at all. What he knew was this: something clearly wanted that soil the way it was. What if the acidity wasn't the problem? What if it was simply waiting for the right crop to ask for it? The banker who signed off on his loan didn't hide his opinion. You know this ground's marginal, Elias. 3 men before you couldn't make it pay. Elias just nodded. He wasn't the kind of man who argued with a banker. He started doing what he always did. He started mapping, not with computers, not with agronomists flown in from the university. With soil probes, extension bulletins from the county office, and his own 2 hands, digging holes across the property, checking the soil at 8 inches, at 12, at 18. He recorded pH in the notebook. He recorded elevation, marking where the ridge rose and where it dropped, using the old surveyor's level the same way he'd used it on the roads. He recorded how fast water moved off each section after a hard rain, and how long the low pockets stayed wet, page after page. The tests confirmed what everybody already believed. The pH across most of the ridge sat low, acidic, wrong for corn, wrong for most pasture grass. But one of the extension bulletins in his stack said something the corn growers had never needed to know. That same acidic soil was exactly what blueberries wanted. The wild berries hadn't proven anything. They'd only made Elias curious enough to go looking. It was the bulletin and his own soil tests that gave him something to actually try. He was not a genius. He didn't know, walking into it, exactly where on that ridge the plants would survive. He only knew where to start looking. He read the bulletin twice, then a 3rd time. He checked the numbers against his own soil tests, matching pH ranges the way he used to match grade stakes on the road crew. One figure against another until they lined up, or they didn't. They lined up. That was enough to justify trying. It wasn't enough to guarantee anything, and some part of him knew that even then. That spring, Elias put in nearly 5 acres of blueberry plants. It cost him close to $4,000, most of what he had left after buying the land. He spread the planting across ground that tested well for acidity, working his way down the slope toward the lower ground, because it was easier to reach and closer to the water line. That was his first mistake. He'd paid close attention to the chemistry of the soil. He hadn't paid close enough attention to how water moved through it. That summer turned out to be a wet one, storm after storm rolling through the county. The lower sections of his planting sat closer to a natural drainage swale than he'd accounted for. The acidity there was correct. Blueberries could use the acidity Elias had found there. But prolonged saturation around the shallow root zone was another matter entirely. The lower rows simply stayed wet too long. By late summer, the leaves in those rows had started turning yellow. then wilting even right after a fresh rain, which made no sense to him at first, since the plants should have had plenty of water. Then the dying started, row after row, through the lower third of the planting. By the time the season ended, Elias had lost close to 60% of that first 5 acres. Nearly $3,000 gone into the ground along with the roots. It hit him hard. Not just the money, though the money mattered plenty to a man who didn't have much of it. It was the doubt. The same doubt the banker had voiced. The same doubt the neighbors carried quietly whenever they drove past his ridge. Elias didn't rush back out with more plants to try and fix it. He got down on his knees and started digging. He pulled dead plants up from the lower rows, one at a time, and studied the roots. Dark, waterlogged, rotted. He walked up to the drier upper rows, dug a few of the surviving plants, and laid the root systems side by side. The difference was obvious once he was looking for it. The dead roots were dark almost to black, soft enough to fall apart between his fingers. The surviving roots were pale, firm, threaded through soil that crumbled dry in his hand even after a week of rain. He hadn't needed a lab to see it. He'd needed to dig in the right 2 places and compare. That night, at his kitchen table, notebook open, Elias wrote a line that would matter more than anything else in that book. Right acid, wrong water. Correct pH wasn't enough on its own. The soil could be perfectly acidic and still kill a blueberry plant if the water didn't move through it fast enough. Elias went back out with the surveyor's level and remapped the whole 54 acres, this time weighing drainage just as heavily as chemistry. 3 rough zones emerged. The upper slopes, rocky and fast draining, where water moved through almost as soon as it fell. The middle slopes, acidic and reasonably well drained, though never as reliable as the top. And the lower pockets near the swale, where water gathered and lingered no matter how good the pH looked on paper. This time, Elias made a decision that cost him something different than money. It cost him acreage. He identified a little over 18 acres as reliable blueberry ground sitting across the upper and middle slopes. The lower wet pockets, close to a third of the property, he decided not to plant at all. The rest of the ridge stayed out of the plan too, at least for now, until testing proved it one way or the other. Neighbors noticed a man committing only a third of his land to the crop everyone was watching, and it didn't help his reputation much. Elias didn't explain himself. He kept working the ground he trusted, adding a few new acres at a time instead of all at once, testing each new section for a full year before deciding whether it belonged in the plan. It was slow, and it stayed that way for a few seasons. No dramatic turnaround, no single harvest that changed everything. Just plants that held through one more winter, and then another, on ground that had already proven it could carry them. By the time Elias had built his blueberry ground up to roughly that 18 acres, the harvests had settled into something modest but real. Some years brought in $11,000 or $12,000 after expenses, enough to keep the place running, nothing more. Then came the spring that changed how people in the county talked about him. Older farmers said they couldn't remember a spring that wet in more than 20 years. Storm system after storm system rolled through, dumping rain on ground already saturated from the winter before. Across the county, low-lying berry patches and garden plots turned into standing water. Farmers who had planted in bottomland, chasing easy access and rich-looking soil, watched entire sections drown. Elias's ridge didn't come through untouched. A narrow borderline strip along the edge of his 18 acres, ground he'd always been unsure about, took real damage that spring. Roots suffered. A portion of those plants didn't make it, the same way a portion of his very first planting hadn't made it years before. Elias didn't pretend otherwise, but the rest of the ridge, the ground he'd mapped and tested and earned the hard way, held. The upper slopes drained the way they always had, water moving through fast, the same way it moved through those old road cuts he remembered from his county crew days. The bulk of his blueberry planting came through the wettest spring in a generation, in far better shape than almost anything else in the area. Word travels in small counties. It wasn't long before the banker who'd once called the ridge Marginal showed up at Elias's gate. He walked the rows with Elias in silence for a while, looking at healthy plants standing in soil that should have been ruined by all that rain, by everything he thought he knew about the land. Finally, he stopped and asked the only question that mattered to him. How did you know which part of the hill to plant? Elias told him plainly. He hadn't known, not at first. He'd watched the road cuts for 20 years and noticed something worth asking about. He'd guessed, planted too much too fast, and lost money finding out he was wrong. He'd dug up his own mistakes to understand them, remapped the ridge, and cut his acreage down instead of pushing it up. Then he'd waited, one season at a time, and let the ground prove itself. The banker nodded, the way people nod when an answer is simpler than they expected and harder than they wanted to hear. That evening, Elias walked up to the highest part of the ridge, where the rock sat closest to the surface and the morning's rainwater had already disappeared into the ground. He opened the old notebook to a page near the front, worn soft at the corner from years of handling. The same page where, after his first failure, he'd written 4 words: right acid, wrong water. He read it once, closed the notebook, and looked out over the rows that had survived. Everybody kept asking how to make the ridge less acidic. Elias asked what already wanted it that way.